Okay, I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad I could make it. This conference corresponds with the reading break at my university, so I'm not missing any classes. This will be a bit of a mess as a presentation. There's too much material in this thing. This is my fourth presentation of this material. I think its first presentation was probably the best. There was less in that lecture, and since then I've been expanding things, and basically now what I have is 2 chapters, and I will be skipping out an awful lot as I go through this material. This is part of a project, a book project that I am tentatively calling Dualities of Historical Imagination. In this presentation, there are really 2 different dualities, although the dualities do multiply. There are 2 different dualities in play. One is a duality in the simplest possible terms between past and present, and the other is a duality between attachment and difference. So I begin. There'll be some incoherences because of what I leave out and because of my misreading of my bad handwriting on this typescript. The present is inhabited by monuments from the past. There exist, of course, the obvious monuments, the ones that are carved in stone or cast in bronze. But there are also the less obvious ones which are carved or cast in people's minds and ways of acting, usually without their being aware that this is so. It is not possible to escape from the past. As long as humans continue to exist, their pasts continue to trail them. Willy-nilly, the past inhabits the present. We see this when would-be radicals end up repeating under profoundly different conditions the tropes and gestures of their predecessors. We see it when military establishments respond to the challenges of previous wars in their preparations for present and future wars. We see it when entire countries find themselves looking back to an imagined past in longing and nostalgia during times when the present disappoints them and their future seems troubling. People's involvement with the past is far from being under the sole control of the historians. Indeed, one can say the same thing of history itself, that multi-pronged and deeply ambiguous term. The ambiguity of the word is inseparable from history's productivity for thinking. The past inhabits the present in a multitude of ways exceeding the ambit of what professional historians do in their attempts to produce new knowledge concerning the past. People engage all the time with what has come to them from the past: traditions, languages, stories, customs, possessions. As young people move through childhood, they are likely to become increasingly aware of the fact that much of what school and their society teaches them to value comes to them as an inheritance from the past. At any rate, this will be so in those societies in which the various reigning authorities try to give young people an awareness of the cultural history of the imagined communities within which they are deemed to live. And now, first illustration. Figure 1.0, I think I call it there. Figure 1.0, a photo taken in Hongzhou village, Anhui province, China, pictures one moment in an explicit attempt to make present, within a pedagogical context, aspects of the Chinese past. The same sort of effort is more or less replicated in a multitude of different ways in many other countries in the world. However, the formal propagation, whether by governments, schools, churches, parties, ethnic associations, non-governmental organizations, or other groups, of particular ways of engaging with and thinking about the past that these groups deem to be beneficial for people in the present, is the smaller part of the matter, when our concern is with the history that inhabits people's minds in the present. For weighty are those residues and revenants of the past that inhabit the present, not because they were deliberately and systematically inculcated, but because they mostly emerged out of the business of living in a particular stratum of a particular society at a particular time, with particular life plans in view and with particular courses of life. The things we carry from the past often inhabit us in ways that we are only dimly aware of, if at all. And yet they impinge upon, inhabit, and even in some ways direct our lives. The past haunts the present in ways that are often unnoticed as being of and from the past. Although remnants and revenants of the past remain in the present, the past itself is gone. By definition, it is no longer with us. Sometimes residues from the past exist in the present in a striking and visible way, monumentally, as it were, even though the monuments in question may not be of the visible sort. More often, these monuments reside in the here and now, unnoticed or barely noticed as ghostly presences. This is a territory that generally emerges far from the watching eyes and even farther from the efforts of historians. And yet these two territories, the territory of the history that emerges in people's minds and sensibilities with only partial input from historians, if any input at all, and the territory of the history that historians make, are by no means entirely disconnected. In the present lecture, my aim is to cast light on the strange enterprise of historical representation by looking at some of its proto-professional roots, and in particular at its roots in attachment and difference. I mean here less history's historical roots than its conceptual and affective roots. These roots are generally not attended to by historians, and indeed, why should historians attend to them? After all, the job of a historian is to produce historical representations. Except in very minor degree, the historian's job is not to reflect on the deep roots of that enterprise. Even among philosophers, the subject of history's affective roots has generally not been a matter of direct concern, although clearly Frank Ankerschmidt's work is a great exception to that generalization. However, we do have available to us some important thinking on another of the proto-professional roots of history, namely its roots in temporal and experiential disjunction. And so in this lecture, I shall offer a quick glance at history's temporal and experiential disjunctiveness before turning to the question of history's affective roots. And now I skip a bit. In the larger project out of which I draw this lecture, one of the things that I propose to investigate is what we might call, indeed, proto-historical consciousness. I do not mean the preface proto to be taken teleologically and thus pejoratively. History's proto-historical roots need to be seen and judged for what they are. Above all, they should not be seen as a defective form of the historical, although when an attempt is made to make claims about the historical past on a foundation of proto-historical thinking and feeling, historians then have the right and the duty to call into question such a move, especially when claims based on little more than a widely accepted collective habitus come to be deployed in present-day political debate. Now, temporal and experiential disjunctiveness. Some examples. Consider firstly the image offered in figure 1.1, which is of a quite striking object, the city gate known as the Porta Nigra in the city of Trier in southwestern Germany. The question here is, what makes this object, the Porta Nigra, historical in the minds of most people who see it today? It was not, so far as we can tell, seen as historical before the 19th century. Indeed, here is what it looked like around the middle of the 17th century. So there we have a very functional Roman city gate. And now what do we have here? We have a church. Where's the gate? It's gone. It has been turned into something else. And here is as it exists now, here as it existed in the middle of the 17th century, with a steeple and with an apse at this end, and an extra story added on top for the monastery church. And we go back here to the present-day form of the Porta Nigra, which began to take shape after Napoleon said, get the religious out of this building, turn it back to its Roman form. And this is what we have. You'll notice they didn't go all the way back to the Roman form because they couldn't bring themselves to take the apse, which of course houses the altar in a Christian church. That remains, but I assure you, no Roman city gate had an apse attached to it. But there it is in the Porta Nigra as we see it today. And now I skip a few bits, and here that page goes. And I want to turn now to another object. And again, the question is, what makes objects of this sort historical? And here I skip past the church, and here we have another church, and I actually should have taken out the giveaway there at the bottom. Everybody who sees this thing without the giveaway of Harbin, which is in what formerly was called Manchuria, thinks that that church is located somewhere in Russia. The church is in fact the Sviatoy Sofisky Sobor, the Holy Sophia Cathedral, is modeled on a church that was located in Kiev. I don't know whether it still exists. Here it is as of November of last year in Harbin, China. Well, in the form of the church that we see here, and the edifice that we see here, the basic edifice, was constructed by emigre Russians between 1923 and 1932, replacing two earlier, less grandiose churches than this massive church we see in front of us. There's no need here to trace out the complex war-torn history of Manchuria and China in the years following 1932. Suffice it to say that after the proclamation of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949, National Day, a treaty between the Soviet Union and China put Holy Sophia into the hands of the new Chinese government. In due course, the building ceased to function as a church. During the Cultural Revolution, it escaped destruction by the Red Guards only because it was so solidly constructed that they were unable to tear it down, although they did destroy its interior furnishings and decorations. Sometime after its use as a church had come to an end, the empty, hulking building was put to another practical use than that of being a church. It became a storage warehouse for a nearby department store. Meanwhile, the city authorities of Harbin filled in the large open space around the building that we see here with quickly erected high-rise buildings containing offices and apartments. These structures came within a few yards of the church on all sides, making it invisible from the street. My informant Yang, a harbiner who as a child lived in one of those apartment buildings, has reported to me that although he and his friends were aware of this building, they didn't give it a second thought. It was something that they barely noticed as they played in the neighborhood. Only in 1996, when the national government declared the Holy Sophia Church a National Cultural Heritage Protection Site, did its situation begin to change. There was great public interest in Harbin in restoring the site to its previous grandeur. The buildings around the church were torn down or removed away. The structural damage that the cathedral had suffered from the Red Guards and through physical neglect was repaired. A museum of the history and culture of Harbin, with many photographs, was set up inside the building, and the ensemble became an important tourist site, rivaling such attractions as Harbin's famous Ice Festival and the nearby Siberian Tiger Park. In this way, Holy Sophia Cathedral became historical. However, things cannot be made historical simply by governmental efforts and or by constructing historical tourist attractions. There are conditions that are required if something is to be historical. Since neither the gate nor the cathedral can be said to be inherently historical, we've seen that since for centuries, for 1600 years, the Porta Nigra was not considered to be historical. And this building only came to be considered historical sometime after the middle of the 1990s. We have to ask what it is that made it possible for them to be seen as historical. Let me suggest that there is a duality here that is already indicated by the temporal décalage between the construction of these monuments and their becoming historical. The duality that is suggested by this delay is a duality between a time or times of presumed initial presence and a later time or times when objects can become historical. The first moment is the moment, but really moments in the plural, of the actual event. In this case, the building of the Porta Nigra and the building of the Holy Sophia. The first moment may well be an extended set of moments. These could be the moments before the objects or deeds in question became historical. The Porta Nigra and the Holy Sophia became historical only later by their being viewed as historical. We make the historical, and we make it in the now, in a sequence of nows, retroactively, as Nietzsche pointed out, casting light on what was in such a way as to reveal something that could not be seen at that time, something that was impossible to see at that time, namely that and how the object or event or situation would become historical. Now I delete some material and pass on. In 1962, Arthur Danto, in his groundbreaking paper, Narrative Sentences, explored a statement that he took to be exemplary of the entire process of historical description and interpretation. The 30 Years' War began in 1618. And I'll also give you another sentence that Danto also deployed in the larger book of which Narrative Sentences was a part. In climbing Mount Ventoux, Windy Mountain, Petrarch opened the Renaissance. The statement, the 30 Years' War began in 1618, draws attention to the fact that no one could have known in 1618 that the military campaigns that were then going on in parts of Central Europe were the opening campaigns of the 30 Years' War. No one could have known this in 1618 because the military campaigns of 1618 and of the years and years following 1618 could only be seen as the 30 Years' War much later, after the signing from May to October 1648 of the various treaties making up the Peace of Westphalia. Danto famously went on to argue that every historical account presupposes at least two, there's a duality, at least two time-separated events. The first of these times is the time of the historical reality that the historian describes. The second time, and most probably later times after that, are those times from the standpoints of which historians look back upon the past and seek to describe it historically. The later times, let us call them the times of interpretation, are times during which events were occurring and situations existed that the historian does not describe, and perhaps does not even acknowledge. And yet the standpoints that become available only in those later times are needed if the historian is to offer any historical account at all. I propose that we use the phrase Danto's duality to name the duality between A, a historical past being described, and also quite likely being explained, interpreted, and argued about, and B, the standpoint or standpoints from which historians and others offer their accounts of the historical past. Danto is obviously correct in his claim that this duality Indeed, this multiplicity, and what is a multiplicity but duality multiplied, is fundamental to the making of a historical past. On a superficial reading, one might think that Danto's point depends on the purely contingent fact that the name of this particular war, the 30 Years' War, could not have been applied to the events that, from a later perspective, made up the war until after hostilities had come to an end. But while it is true that the name of the 30 Years' War gives Danto's point an intuitive obviousness, the same point applies to all events that we come to see as historical. The issue is not the name of the war, but rather how the events in question came to be seen as that war. Danto's point has to do with what he calls a retroactive, there's that word again, a retroactive realignment of the past, which, he goes on to say, might be multiplied indefinitely, since all history, he contends, involves retroactive realignment. Now I skip 5 immortal and extremely important pages, and we thus make some progress toward the proper end of this lecture, and here we are. But Danto's line of argument, illuminating though it is, does not answer, let alone ask the question, why might people want to investigate the past in the first place? Danto's lack of interest in this question surely derives from the fact that he took the historical project, the project of historians, he took the historical project, namely the historian's enterprise of investigating the past, as a given. Since by their very vocation, professional historians have the job of investigating the past, Danto just didn't go back and take a further backward step to ask why they have that. I mean, that's not his issue. There are historians. He had studied with historians at Wayne State University. He accepts that they do the particular job that they do, and that's it. Danto had no reason to see as strange and in need of explanation the indeed strange fact that there are people in the world who are interested in what Petrarch did when he was living in France in the 1430s, or what various bands of soldiers did in Europe in the summer and fall of 1618. Moreover, as we all know, Danto was responding to Hempel 1942. And basically, Danto was engaged in the project of defending the cognitive validity and value of what historians do. So Danto was really engaged, from his perspective, in defense of history. And again, from his perspective, he did not ask the question, why on earth are historians engaging in this strange project? One of the things that is missing from Danto, aside from the asking of that question, which is basically the question, why history? One of the things that is strikingly missing from Danto's project is the affective dimension from history. And I think it's also missing from Collingwood. At least it's missing from Collingwood's explicit philosophy of history. I don't think it's missing from Collingwood's actual work as a historian and archaeologist. When Collingwood, and Collingwood is notoriously slippery, when Collingwood says that all history is the history of thought, I think what one has there is an omission of another aspect of the historical, which is the aspect of feeling. So feeling and the affective are missing from Danto, so far as I can see, and they're also missing from Collingwood. To try to pick up on what is missing, I want to turn here toward what I shall call popular history. By popular history in the present context, I do not mean the kinds of representations of the past that we find in movies or in television series. Such productions are popular entertainments in many countries in the world. Often they provide highly fictionalized accounts put forward with patriotic intent, usually, of past wars or battles or other events in the national history of the country, whichever country it is, within which they are being produced. Rather, here I mean by popular history, history that arises from the people out of their needs, out of human needs, as they live their lives in the present. We might say that there is, among the various needs that human beings have, a historical need. And of course, I'm channeling here Nietzsche again, Nietzsche of 1874. That there's a popular history that arrives out of specific groups of people, I'm arguing, people who are separated from and yet are in other ways connected with other groups of people. Identity and difference, sameness and otherness clearly come into play here, and I contend are irreducible elements in what we call history. Popular history, in the sense of the term that I deploy here, is related to other forms. Perhaps these other forms are themselves forms of popular history. Popular history is related to tradition, to memory, and to commemoration. And also, in a certain, somewhat distant way, it's related to what Hayden White in 1980 or so called, with some sense of irony, but not a complete sense of irony, proper history. All of these are modalities of engaging with the past. Tradition, memory, and commemoration are different from history, but also strongly akin to history. The felt need for engagement with the past that expresses itself in tradition, memory, and commemoration is profoundly connected with a felt need for history more generally. Indeed, without what we acquire from these other modalities of engaging with the past, history, as it is understood and practiced by historians in the West, and I think also not only in the West, would be inconceivable and indeed impossible. And now I pass on several pages, and I'm going to turn to the related theme, a related duality, to the duality between past and present, which is temporal and also experiential disjunction. I turn to related duality, the duality of attachment and difference. We need examples that are more open to the human connections that make up history than are the examples of the gate and the cathedral. For example, it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to gain any access to the people who actually built the Porta Nigra. In fact, specialists in Roman history and Roman archaeology don't even know exactly when the Porta Nigra was built. It was built sometime roughly between in the last quarter of the 2nd century Christian era, but that's about as close as people can say. We need examples that will illustrate features of the roots of history that are not so well visible to us in the gate and the cathedral. I say illustrate, not demonstrate or prove. The claims in question, the claims that I'm making, are theoretical claims, and they're in fact thus not claims of a sort that can be proved by any particular set of cases, but they can be illustrated by cases. In the examples that I'm about to point to, I focus on some people's ways of feeling, responding to, and making history. In a particular moment or set of moments, these people reflected on, and I'm getting there, reflected on and responded to a historical world that had made them, and that by the 1980s they were losing or had already lost. From out of the particularities of their situation, who is the they? We'll see in a moment. They reflected on history in a remarkably thorough and variegated way, leaving records of their reflections primarily as published chronicles or sets of chronicles, as memory books focused on particular communities, as personal memoirs, as historical markers, as documented ceremonies and rituals of commemoration, and as books of photographs. These now persist as remnants from the past that are available for our contemplation and analysis, hic et nunc. The people whose existence has led me to reflect on these matters were immigrants and descendants of immigrants to a particular rural municipality, roughly equivalent to a county in the terminology of many countries, located in Western Canada in the east-central part of the province of Saskatchewan. In 2016, Saskatchewan's total population was about 1 million people. The rural municipality, which bears the name of Rural Municipality of Willow Creek, number 458, occupies a near square of territory that is 18 miles by 18 miles in the old means of measuring, 29 kilometers by 29 kilometers in the more advanced means of measuring. 18 mile by 18 mile, you can see the geometrical thinking here, square of territory that made up this county. It's not actually an exact square because the globe, the quadrature of the globe is impossible. And here I'm going to skip past here and I'll just show you, there it is. And there is a correction line because it can't be a square because lines of longitude are not parallel. They come together at the poles. And there's the particular county, the particular rural municipality from which I will draw my examples. In 2016, a total of 630 people were living in this square of territory, Willow Creek, rural municipality number 458. In contrast, the 1931 Canadian census counted 3,745 people in the RM, and the RM reached its highest recorded population, 4,185 persons in 1936. Then from the late 1930s onward, the population declined in every succeeding census. This decline was not the result of some sort of disaster. It was a result, rather, of the increasing mechanization of agriculture that occurred in North America from the early 1920s onward, and a result as well of the fact that during most of this period, surplus workers could easily find better paying work elsewhere in Canada. In the Alberta oil fields, in lumbering and mining operations in various places, and in factories and service jobs in towns and cities throughout much of Canada, from Toronto westward to Vancouver. By the time of the 1951 census, which recorded 2,947 inhabitants, the RM had lost almost 30% of its population compared to the population in 1936. With its reported population, as I said, of 630 in 2016, the RM had 6.5 times fewer people than in 1936, a decline in population of almost 83%. Yeah, but don't cry for Willow Creek because people could easily leave and find jobs elsewhere in Canada. They had, for example, single-payer medical care, and they could just move very easily. They could move, and they would have medical care, and they would have some sort of social welfare protection, although not a very extensive social welfare protection, but it was enough. The population of Willow Creek was populated in the years, basically it was populated in the years from 1906 through to the middle of the 1930s, when there was a large influx of immigrants coming from previously untapped sources of population, previously untapped by the Canadian federal government. In 1896, a new government came into office, a Liberal government, and the new Minister of the Interior, who was responsible for immigration, decided to draw population from Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe, and also from Northern Europe. This meant basically Swedes, but they were actually Norwegians. It meant Ukrainians, it meant Poles, and various other ethnic groups from those territories. The people were attracted, these immigrants were attracted to Canada by the amazing offer of 160 acres of land, 1/4 of a square mile of land, for a $10 fee. You put down $10, you got 160 acres. Then you had to work your butt off in order to get actual title of it. But you could get title within as little as 3 years, and also at that time, one could gain Canadian citizenship in as little as 3 years. So people moved there because of the land. This was a vast, untapped territory in the eyes of the Canadian government, needed to be settled. They found themselves with 160 acres of land, but they also found themselves in a harsh and forbidding climate. In the RM of Willow Creek, which was an area of bushland, rather than the grassy plains to be found further south, they had the backbreaking task of clearing their new land in order even to begin cultivating it. The roads were bad, communication was difficult, although the land was fertile and the summer climate generally favorable to agriculture. Disasters such as late or early frosts or late season hailstorms could destroy the better part of a season's work. Over bad roads, it was difficult to transport grain to the nearest railside elevator. Railside grain elevator, and so on and so on. They faced many difficulties. Under these circumstances, the impulse of the new settlers, especially those who came from afar and were new to English-speaking culture, and some of the immigrants were English speakers. They came from other parts of Canada. They came from the British Isles, and they also came from the United States. And they generally populated the southern part of the RM. There's a railway line that ran about 5 miles south of the southern border of the rural municipality. And then the northern parts of the municipality were populated by other ethnic groups. You can't, I think, read the details of this map, but basically in the east and in the west, there was a heavy concentration of Norwegians. In the central area up to the top, there were Slavs, Poles and Ukrainians, more Ukrainians than Poles. And in the central core, there was a group of Jews. They're concentrated together because they were Orthodox Jews and they had to be within walking distance of their synagogue. The map is a little misleading because it seems to suggest that these were ethnically homogeneous settlements, but in fact, people were mixed in together. It was accidental where land might be available with roads allowing access to the 160 acres. It was quite accidental which specific plots of land would be available at any given time. So it's more that most of the people in the south were Anglos, most of the people in the east and west were essentially Norwegians, and most of the people in the central area were Slavs. And again, the area of Jewish concentration also had many settlers of other ethnicities. Under these circumstances, the impulse of the new settlers, these circumstances of great difficulty, the impulse of these new settlers, especially those who came from afar and were new to English-speaking culture, was to adhere very firmly to their own particular traditions and customs. This meant primarily adherence to their religion, whatever that religion was. A religious congregation provided a link among people who would come to Canada from the old country, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 miles away, whatever the old country was. It meant the preservation, at least for a generation or two, of customs and rituals and language from that now far distant place. Further, religious congregations increased the flow of useful information among the group and also could serve as an insurance mechanism, offering some measure of help when disaster struck. Moreover, we can speculate, the existence of other ethnic communities in the same territory may well have encouraged the adherence of each community to its own traditions. With few exceptions, each congregation also established a separate hall for social events. So building a church, or in one case, a synagogue, building a house of worship, then almost invariably the congregations constructed a separate social hall for social engagement that were non-religious. Thus, the congregations served as centers for sociability and for entertainment, for secular singing and dancing as distinguished from church ritual. And also, almost invariably in Willow Creek number 458, each religious congregation constructed a cemetery. That is a place for a commemoration of the dead, for interment and commemoration of the dead. To be sure, there were also civic institutions in the RM of Willow Creek number 458, institutions that had the effect of tying people together across their ethnic divisions. For example, by law, every child attended a public state school, where children whose home language was Norwegian or Polish or Ukrainian or Yiddish learned to speak and write English. And the governmental council of the RM, which was elected by the people, characteristically had counselors from most of the different ethnic groups in the RM. And now I'm going to skip a bit and details of immigration and so on. And now I resume and I do the show and tell at this point. I go back to the relics, the monuments, the historical monuments that remain. These actually are, that building is about 20 miles from where I spent 14 years of my childhood. But I've never saw that building. I have not ever in my life seen that building, but it was very close to where I lived. And nor have I seen the other three buildings that I will show. This is the synagogue. It's Edenbridge, at Edenbridge, Saskatchewan. There's actually no community there. Edenbridge was the name chosen for the post office and for the little elementary school that was close to the synagogue. The school districts were very small, 4 miles by 4 miles maximum, because children had to be able essentially to walk to school. Young children had to be able to walk to school. This place is called Edenbridge. Actually, its real name is Yidenbrik, which means in Yiddish, Jew bridge. But of course, these people came to Canada, they had to assimilate, and they just couldn't call their settlement Jew Bridge. There was a government bridge that was put across the Carrot River, so that the bridge and the Jews were living near it, so Jew Bridge, Edenbridge. So they picked a very British name, Edenbridge. Oh yes, wonderful. So that's the name of the place, but nobody ever settled there because people settled on the land. You had to actually, essentially, you had to occupy the 160 acres of land you farmed and would eventually own if you succeeded in your farming activities. And now this is St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Church. By the way, the synagogue was built in 1909. This was built in 1912, St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Church. Maryville is the name of the closest school. This photograph was taken a couple of years ago, and you can see that this building is essentially, it's going into ruin, and it will eventually collapse. And now I give you another example. This is Holy Ascension Ukrainian Orthodox Church, also at Maryville. It is about 200 meters from the previous church. These were true Ukrainians who broke off from the Ukrainian Catholic Church, where they actually had Catholic priests. You know, they can bring in Catholic, how do we bring in Ukrainian? Okay, so they wanted real Ukrainianness. So this church broke off from the Ukrainian Catholic Church, St. Nicholas. That was constructed in the middle of the 1930s. And you can see how much more orthodox it is in its construction, and that will eventually completely disappear. You can see also the cemetery in the foreground, and clearly somebody has put flowers, probably artificial flowers, though I'm not sure, by the grave. So somebody around there has some kind of connection with that church, but nobody knows who owns it. Because when the congregation, when so many people had moved away that the congregation could not be maintained, it was discovered that this church, because it was autocephalous, there was no church organization above it, and it would be so it's legally impossible to find out who owns that building. It's sort of in a legal limbo, and it doesn't matter. In another 80 years, it will be dust. And now we have St. Helen's Roman Catholic Church, which is another half mile south. No, it's about another 250 meters south of the church we last looked at. This church dates back to I think it's 1914, but it burned down twice. So this is a 1960s version of that church. And you might see it's nondescript. It's not very, in some sense, it's not very interesting. It's not as interesting as the previous houses of worship. But if you actually look back, you can see that there is a generic connection to that church. I mean, it follows a kind of relatively widespread steeple form common in European churches of a certain kind. Now, those are the objects. I want to say a little bit more about the theoretical aspects, the theoretical issues those churches raise. And much of what I've written down here I've already given to you. Yes, I don't think I need to tell you that again. But I need to tell you about the endings. The synagogue ceased to function in 1964. There were simply not enough Jews left there for it to keep going. People, remember, were emigrating from the rural municipality. St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Church ceased to function in 1990. It kept going for quite a while, in other words. By the way, the synagogue, there were enough people around with an interest in the synagogue that it was actually renovated. So there's no way a synagogue from 1909 could have the rather nice appearance that the building has now. So Ukrainian Catholic Church ceased to function in 1990. Holy Ascension Ukrainian Orthodox Church, reduced to 3 members, ceased to function around 1963. And St. Helen's Polish Catholic Church, I mean, there's a church organization of some weight, ceased to function on August 25th, 1985, with a closing Mass, although an informant tells me that there is still a commemorative Mass there once every summer. And publicly available cemetery records indicate that there are still burials taking place in the cemetery attached to that church at the rate of 1 or so a year. There's food for thought here, thought that might lead us in a variety of different directions. We might reflect, for example, on the functionality of religious tradition for poor and looked down upon strangers finding themselves in a brutally unforbidding landscape and climates. In the old days, 40 degrees below zero, that works in centigrade and Fahrenheit, was a pretty normal temperature during the winter. I have not been back there for a long time. Global warming, no doubt, is having its effect. Probably it only goes down to 35 degrees below zero these days, so things are looking up. We might reflect, for example, on the functionality of religious tradition for poor and looked down upon strangers finding themselves in a brutally unforbidding landscape and climate. The churches were more than simply churches. They were sites for performance of rites of social solidarity, providers of dancing and singing, places for the exchange of information, as I said, and sources of insurance against disaster. The population in this corner of the rural municipality was mixed, as we know from that RM map that I've showed you. To judge from the names of the people, the population was in this area a mixture of Ukrainians, Jews, Poles, and Anglos, all within close reach of where a particular north-south road. The 3 churches are on the same road called Maryville Road, and it's very mixed within that territory. And the synagogue is about 3 kilometers further to the east on another road, Grid Road number 681. And again, it's in a generally quite, what was in the initial period of settlement, a generally mixed area. Now, of course, there are huge farms. They're often owned by corporations that are probably family corporations. People would move away. Only one person would be able to actually farm the land. Other people would be God knows where in Canada. And so they would form a corporation in order to deal with the land. Our concern here, however, is not with those particular churches, nor is it with cultural solidarity and tradition, and even less is it with the problematic notion of identity, which I've actually barely touched in what I've read out to you today. Our concern here is with history's roots in attachment and difference. Here we are not interested in the story of Maryville, Edenbridge, for their own sake. We're interested in what they can show us about a theoretically interesting issue, namely how history might emerge from its forerunners. In a quite striking passage in his classic work, The Idea of History, Collingwood contended that, and I quote Collingwood, "History is neither aesthesis nor nomos," neither aesthesis nor law, nor is it a combination of the two. History is a wholly reasoned knowledge of what is transient and concrete. Collingwood was a very great philosopher of history, but on this point, I think, he was seriously wrong. Firstly, I agree that history is concerned with what is transient, with what is événementiel, as Brodel would say. But history is also concerned with entities that persist. Further, history is undoubtedly, as Collingwood says, reasoned knowledge. But it is not wholly reasoned knowledge. You know, Collingwood sometimes had a tendency to make overstatements. For not everything in the field of history can be reasoned out. Finally, Collingwood says that history is neither aesthesis nor nomos. I would agree that for the most part, history is not aesthesis, not sensitivity, nor is it nomos. But firstly, history does contain a nomos-oriented dimension, as, for example, in social science-oriented history, wherein the historian deploys theory in the interests of historical understanding. And secondly, history does contain a dimension of aesthesis, which is what I shall be mainly concerned with in what remains to be said here. 10. Okay, good. Well, it's on track. Okay, I can even take 5 seconds to say that. What is missing from Collingwood's philosophy of history, although not, I think, from his own experience as an archaeologist and historian of Roman Britain, are the elements of sensibility and of attachment and of difference that feed, if not directly into history, then certainly into a realm that makes history possible, which I think is the realm of history that we can see on Maryville Road and on the nearby Grid Road. How did the objects that I have focused on in this small part of Willow Creek Rural Municipality number 458 get transformed into objects that are in some sense objects of history, as distinguished from being simply objects of present utility? Oh, I shouldn't have said simply. I mean, objects of present utility, that's complex, okay? Of course, all four of these objects speak to us of death and transience, as seen by several facts: that they no longer function as houses of worship, that they are adjacent to places for the interment and commemoration of the dead, and that two of them are falling into ruin, exemplifying in their own architectural being the graveyards that are found adjacent to them. Of course, I am using the physical objects as a synecdoche for the communities that they represented and sustained, at least for a time. The objects are important. They do have a kind of attractive force to them. But more important is their connection to particular communities of people, people who in most cases have scattered to places far distant from the rural municipality of Willow Creek number 458. One way that an object or a community now long departed can become historical is when historians de profession pay attention to them. Here I think of E.H. Carr's observation in What is History, that a fact becomes historical when it enters into a historian's account. And it is true that in a minor way, at least one of these communities, the Edenbridge Hebrew colony, has been discussed in a substantial MA thesis, albeit written by a geographer, but done in a very historical mode. What I want to suggest here is that there are popular modes of historical perception that have a theoretical significance, even though they are vastly different from the kind of work that professional historians do. They are theoretically significant because they lead us to think both about other ways of making sense of the past than the ways of professional historians, and because they also lead us to think about what may well be omissions and blind spots within the professional discipline of history, and maybe even within philosophy of history. The ways of making sense that I'm thinking of are forms of popular history that arise out of popular mentality, at least in societies in which the right preconditions exist. The popular representation of history has the capacity to arise in the minds of people who, firstly, are of a certain age, generally, a relatively advanced age, who, secondly, are essentially retired from active business, and thirdly, who have had an education that has given them a basic literacy in the writing of their language, and fourthly, who have a relatively high degree of economic security against disasters. These people can produce history, forms of history, that differ from professional scientific history in various ways. In the short time that I have left, I want to give just a few examples of popular history of this type. It is popular history that is not in any explicit way aimed at advancing a particular political position or agenda. Rather, it seems motivated by a feeling of attachment, the feeling of a need to resume a connection with something that is now receding into the past. One type of history of this sort is history that is primarily visual, history that takes upon itself the task of photographing objects that the authors and photographers feel have a connection to the community whose past they are lovingly attempting to preserve, even as in many cases the objects themselves are in course of disappearing or being changed irrevocably. I'll give you one example, and now will it appear? Come on. There's the mighty Carrot River and a bridge across the river, and I'll get back to that. But here is an interesting object. This is a book by Lloyd and Rose Fearag, a retired couple living in Lebret, a village in southern Saskatchewan, who took upon themselves the task of photographing all the 161 surviving Ukrainian churches in rural Saskatchewan, plus many of the cemeteries and bell towers. So that is a form of history, of popular history. Or there's the comparable but less exhaustive book by Basil Rotov, Roman Yerenyuk, and Stella Hryniuk in their study of Ukrainian churches in Manitoba. To this one can add the work of Margaret Krinbium and Frank Korvemacher, with photographs by Larry Easton that offers a remarkably well-done photographs of and commentaries on a large selection of churches plus 5 synagogues in rural Saskatchewan. I can't remember whether I actually photographed that to show to you. And finally, in the same genre is David McClellan's book, now out of print and remarkably expensive, offering photographs and summary accounts of our towns, Saskatchewan communities, from Abbey to Zenon Park. Here, I would argue, is history as a form of attachment. There is something seemingly immediate about the photographic medium that gives us the illusion of touching something that we cannot really touch, namely the experience of the past. Of course, we understand that it is an illusion. We understand that we are not there. We understand that there is a divide between the page and us, which perhaps gives this particular medium an advantage over other media and modes of presentation, in which perhaps the unbridgeable distance between the moment of the now and past moments is not adequately respected. But now I want to turn back to rural municipality number 458. And in particular, I want to turn to a heavy 960-page book. It's a chronicle. It's chronicle in Hayden White's sense, or rather, it is a set of chronicles. It's 960 pages long with wide, double-spaced column pages. It's entitled Our Courageous Pioneers, History of Gronlid and Surrounding Districts of Argus, Athol, these are all school districts. They're all dead, these school districts. Argus, Athol, Edenbridge, Freedom, Maryville, Murphy Creek, Sandhill Creek, Tailman, Terrace, Teddington, produced and published by the Gronlid and District Historical Society, and printed by Phillips Publishers in Milford, Saskatchewan in 1991. This book is, in fact, the source from which I've drawn much, but not all, of my information about Edenbridge and Maryville in this talk, in these chapters. The book deals not with the entirety of the rural municipality, but rather with only 11 of its school districts, leaving out 12 others. It has more pages than were people left in that territory in 1991 when it was published. It deals in sequence with the area's churches and one synagogue, roads, transport, economics, organizations, sports and schools, and offers a multitude of short family histories. It is, in effect, a work of quiet celebration. Our Courageous Pioneers celebrates the parents and grandparents of the multiple authors. As an alternative title, which was considered but then left aside, We Have Come a Long Way. That alternative title suggests the progress from 1913, when the rural municipality was established as a governmental entity, to 1991, when the book was published. In the terminology of Hayden White, the book is written in, indeed, the chronicle form, not in the form of proper history, because the story that the book tells does not properly end. Rather, for the most part, it simply terminates. And that's what this lecture is going to do. But I terminate with 2 people who are in the book. Their family history is told in a column or two in the book. And I didn't know the woman, actually, the Jews who settled in Saskatchewan, they came from Lithuania. But they took the long way to Canada. They went from Lithuania to South Africa. Then somebody saw an ad for 160 free acres, and they decided to pick up roots in South Africa, sell their business, and come to Saskatchewan. They felt it was a little too hot in South Africa, and the climate in Canada might be more welcoming. The man was the butcher to whom I was often sent to pick up cuts of meat when I was a child. So there's the termination. It's not an end. It's, in a sense, I'm emulating popular history in simply stopping. Okay, that's it.